Flo here with a word that's just weird. Terry cloth. Who exactly is Terry? And why does he get his own fabric? Did he journey below SPF 50? Fight off some weeds in his daffodils? How about a word for everyone? Flotection. Yeah, I just made it up. But I'm not making up how great it feels when me and Progressive protect your new home. Ever think of that, Terry? No. Terry only thinks of himself.
Save an average of 17% on car insurance when you bundle home and auto through Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discount not available in all states or situations.
Welcome to the Full Court Press Podcast. Insights and observations from around the National Basketball Association. We aim to provide an intellectual and analytical perspective to what is happening on the court. Here's your host, Glenn Willis.
Okay, we're back with what was initially intended to be kind of a monthly check-in with my good friend Dane Moore on the Timberwolves. We're recording on Sunday. They play Memphis on Monday
and Denver on Wednesday.
Would presume that they would win the Memphis game, but we'll get into that. That's on the rundown. But the last time that matchup occurred in Target Center did not go well at all. One of maybe the worst loss on the season.
It was so funny. I was sitting there at that game before, and I sit by another Timberwolves writer named Britt Robson, and I was thinking about the fans who are there at the game, right? And like, why even come to this game? You're not going to leave happy. Like, it's either they take care of business and they beat the clearly tanking Memphis Grizzlies, or it's a close game and they barely beat them and you don't feel very good about that, or they lose and it's a mess. And they lost. And it was a mess. Everyone was Tom Thibodeau after the game, threw Karl Towns and Andrew Wiggins out of the bus. Karl Towns talked to the media afterwards. He grabbed his clothes in the locker room and went into the cafeteria to change by himself. And that game really inspired what it's been an odd past, I would say, 2 weeks since then. Monday will be 2 weeks since that last game. And it's really been a contentious environment in Minnesota surrounding the Timberwolves. Obviously, it's kind of the end of Jimmy Butler and this anxiety around when he's going to come. And the team just clearly desperately needed him. They're losing games to teams like Memphis. They're getting whooped by teams like Philadelphia and Utah, who are good teams. But in theory, the Wolves should be kind of sort of competing with. Yeah. And then even against the games they're winning or against Atlanta and Dallas, who they beat both of them by single digits. This has been a really long time since you felt good about a Timberwolves game, win or loss. And then Jimmy Butler comes back and he played on Saturday night and they did get a win. And it does feel like things are stabilizing a bit, but it has been very bizarre in that locker room and around the team.
So Butler's first game back was, and we're going to do a quick kind of reset on the conference here, but they were trailing, if I recall correctly, they were trailing by like about 10 for most, like even into like pretty well, like 3 or 4 minutes into the fourth quarter. And then they finally kind of took control.
One quarter. So it was the first half that they were down by 10. And I was concerned because I was like, okay, if Butler's back and they're still losing the Lakers by 10 in a game that they need to win to get into the playoffs, that I was concerning. And to their credit, as messed up as the previous couple of weeks were, they took care of business, kind of blew it up to, I think, like 15. They came back and had that 15-point lead in the third quarter and then ended up winning by like 20 by the end of the game. So turns out Jimmy Butler helps.
Yeah, so I was watching that game on and off. I mean, obviously my tracking the score and stuff like that, but we're at a point where there's like so many meaningful games on some evenings.
Oh yeah.
And I still remember recording with Chris Axman about the Christmas Day games, and I remember the one comment I made about Minnesota was it was more work than it should have been to beat that Lakers team. Now the Lakers have been better than the second half than they were in the first half. I don't know if record wise, but just in terms of like being a tough team to beat, right?
Yeah, I was concerned about that game, honestly, because, and we'll get into it, but I've been viewing the Timberwolves without Jimmy Butler as maybe a middle of the pack team in the NBA. Maybe. Like, And so going into a game on a back-to-back against the Lakers, who I think the Lakers are a middle-of-the-pack NBA team. I mean, they have been the second half of the year. They beat the Spurs in overtime on Wednesday, a couple days before that, and I was concerned about that. I kind of had the Wolves on this similar plane as the Lakers. I think it showed that the Wolves had more to play for than the Lakers did, but yeah, it's just it got to this point where it was concerning that maybe the Wolves just aren't even. It is concerning that if the Wolves aren't a playoff caliber team without Jimmy Butler, that's a pretty big red flag.
It is. So before we get into that, how did Butler look? Did he look physically right? I don't know that I recall any specific plays that gave me a good feeling or a not good feeling. I would imagine it was at least good mentally for the team for him to be on the court and kind of restore some order and some confidence in themselves as a group and those sorts of things. But physically, how did he look?
Well, it was definitely that first. The mental element was huge. He had 2 steals in the first minute of the game. And obviously the biggest thing the Timberwolves need is defense. And it does inspire a sort of energy. You see more activity, I think, particularly out of Jeff Teague and Andrew Wiggins when Jimmy Butler's on the floor. I'm not sure exactly what inspires that other than seeing one player try really hard. But physically, yes, Butler, he looked 100%. It was a little bit different in that they changed his rotations. He came out halfway through the first quarter, where normally he's like 11 minutes in the first quarter kind of guy, if that makes sense. And so he ended up only playing 22 minutes in the game. I guess it's hard to fully grasp the physicality of it. He looked tired in 22 minutes, but I don't know. I mean, I'm just subjectively looking at him gasping for air, which he probably was. But as far as like explosiveness, that all did appear to be there. There might be a little bit of knocking off the rust from a stamina standpoint, but Jimmy always said when we've been asking him about his return and the whole rust and being able to come back, he's like, I'm the most mentally tough person in the NBA. If I get tired, I will just decide to not be tired. And he kind of rolls with that. And I guess he hasn't been proven wrong yet. So it was encouraging.
Yeah. LeBron might have something to say about that. The guy leading the league in minutes and is this his 15th year? A little bit nuts. So let's do a quick rundown. So Houston, Golden State, and Portland. I'm going to go ahead and call Portland the 3 seed, even though I agree. It looks like there's a path where the Utah could catch them. Utah and Portland do play each other in their last game of the season, but I'm not going to even go to the tiebreakers there. Portland at Denver on Monday night is a big game from the Timberwolves standpoint. Utah plays the Lakers on Sunday today. They're sitting at 46 wins, along with now the Pelicans who won on Saturday, the Spurs who won on Saturday, the Thunder who won on Saturday, and then you have Minnesota and Denver sitting at 45 and 45. It looks like it's going to be either Minnesota or Denver, although there probably is a path to those two getting in. The Pelicans play, for example, the Clippers and the Spurs. That's not 2 automatic wins. Even the Clippers who are now eliminated, you'll wonder how that'll affect the rotations, who plays, those sorts of things. But the Clippers play hard all the time, no matter who's on the court. So I don't think you can take that for granted. So it's there's still like 4 through 9 now. Mm-hmm. There's one game that separates all of those groups. And just as a reminder, the first tiebreaker is a team that won its division, which will not be applicable because Houston, Golden State, and Portland will presume will be their division winners. Next is head-to-head. Next tiebreaker is division record if 2 teams are in the same division, then conference, and then non-conference. So that's the rundown. Denver has Portland on Monday, as I said, and then Minnesota on Wednesday. Minnesota has Memphis, as we've talked about, on Monday, and then Denver on Wednesday. So I haven't looked at like 538 or any of the projection sites to see what the percentage is because there's just 2 games left, so it's not that hard to kind of figure out. But just thoughts on the team, the media, the fan base feeling like they're likely to be in versus out, or
losing the Denver game opened the door when they lost on Friday to kind of being out of the playoffs. If they win that game, they pretty much sealed it up. They could obviously still get in if they win they control their own destiny. So that's great. But yeah, it's concerning. I don't even know if the Wolves are definitely the favorite at home against Denver on Wednesday for the final game of the season. Will be a play-in game. But I think it's just been kind of interesting from a Nuggets perspective, is they were in this exact same spot last year where they were just a game out of making the playoffs. And I don't know if that makes them hungrier or not, but I guess I just personally have, even with Butler back, I'm not certain the Wolves are the better team. It helps to be home. When you ask about the fan base, it's a mess. I mean, you can't go on Timberwolves Twitter or Reddit or whatever without hearing fire Tibbs, this and that, all over the place. I mean, it's a mess. Games, you're hearing boos when they've lost. They lost to Utah on Saturday. Boos rained down as they got beat up by Ricky Rubio, which was funny. So it's not a good environment in the fan base. That said, there's a realistic possibility that the Wolves get like the 5 seed, which would be given where they were, they would have a shot at winning a first round series. You were mentioning all the tiebreakers. The Wolves stack up great in almost all of the head-to-head tiebreakers. If anyone's not familiar with the Wolves, many of their losses have come to really bad Eastern Conference teams this season, meaning they've taken care of a lot of the West teams. So they do stack up very well in the tiebreakers. So even if the Wolves have the same record as, if it's like a 4-way tie or something at the bottom of the standings, the Wolves might just get the 5 seed on the group head-to-head tiebreaker there. So as contentious as it's been for the past couple of weeks in Minnesota, I think a lot of things, everyone will take at least a big deep breath if they're able to get into the playoffs, and 2 deep breaths if they can get the 6th seed or above. That's kind of where I'm looking at it. Is that in the Western Conference as a whole, I see 4 different tiers. I see the 1 and 2. You have Golden State and Houston, who are whatever. They're going to sweep their first round series. And then in the 3 through 6, whoever those teams are, either team could win those series, home or away. I wouldn't be surprised to see an upset in that. And then you have the 7 and 8, and then there's the 9 and the 10. The Clippers are now out of it there. It seems like what's going to happen is the teams who really take care of business in these last couple of games are going to get into that obtainable second tier of 3 through 6. And then 2 of the teams are going to fall into the 7 or 8 group. Right now, it feels like the Timberwolves or the Nuggets are going to be in that less desirable 7 or 8. I don't know what the other team will be there, but I've drawn a big line in the sand there for much of the season, because for the Timberwolves, if they miss the playoffs, it's not the end of the world. I know we've talked about this before, is they get their first round draft pick that they won't have to give to Atlanta if they miss the playoffs, which would be huge for the team. So for me, the fan in me, or the trying to think about the big picture, what's good for the fan bases, I think about the 6th seed or better, and then it's worth the playoff experience. I don't know if it's worth the playoff experience to stumble backwards into the 8th seed so as to just get swept by Houston. So that's kind of what I'm operating on in these next 2 games.
Yeah, it does seem like when you look across the tiebreakers that if they get in, unless they're just 1 game behind everybody,
yes,
that they're going to land in a pretty good spot. So weird that they're not in yet, but they swept 4 games versus the Pelicans, is what my notes say. 3 out of 4 versus OKC.
Yep.
1 and 2 against the Spurs. So that's the one where they don't have the tiebreaker. I think that's the only team they don't have a tiebreaker with there.
And Utah, but Utah's kind of
Utah's
separated himself a bit.
Yeah. But it's the last day is interesting because all these teams play each other.
I know.
Utah, Portland, Spurs, Pelicans, Nuggets, Timberwolves. And if I recall correctly, on the last day of the season, typically they try to get all those games to start at the same time, so that there's we should probably look that up.
I was looking. I'm not sure if that's the case or not.
They do that in the NFL. But now I'm recalling like the Kobe's last game.
Right. Yeah.
I can't remember who they were playing. They were playing a team that needed help to get in. Maybe I think that was Utah.
Okay.
A couple years ago.
I do think that Denver and Portland game's later. I'm pretty sure. Yep. Those games are at 9:30 and the Wolves are at 7. So.
Okay. So the Jazz and Portland will probably have their fate determined by them. We're already assuming they're going to have that 3 seed.
If Portland loses to Denver, though.
Yeah.
That could
the Jazz could go in looking to get
Steal
all
the
the way
three
to 3 seed. Yeah. Man. So we're going to just so listeners, Dane and I are recording now, and then we're going to record with my brother Greg, our typical weekly show, and do a playoff preview. So we'll try to not get into too much content there, but it's funny because, we're talking about Coach of the Year, and I think league-wide people are kind of just penciling in Brad Stevens for what he's done with the injury-riddled team. But if the Jazz end up with a 3 seed, that could swing that award way over towards Quinn Snyder. But we'll get into that later on.
It's been impressive, man. They came into Minnesota and destroyed them. I've been following them and watching them for much of this run, but totally different tier club right now than the Wolves are. And granted, the Wolves didn't have Butler, but I don't think it would have mattered. I think the Jazz are a lot better than the Timberwolves at this juncture of the season. I mean, they are just clicking. And as you mentioned, Snyder deserves a lot of credit there.
Yeah, Jazz play like a team that's always confident in what they're doing, always confident in what their coaches instructing them to do, whether it's calling a play at action or what have you, and where the relationship between Tibbs and the Wolves players is quite different from that.
It's so funny whenever I have a friend who is a college basketball coach, and he rags on me a lot for following the NBA and how the NBA is not as great as college basketball. That's of course his opinion. But whenever he gets a chance to watch Utah play, he's like, that's like a college team with real pro athletes. And I was like, yeah, they do play like a team. And if you have good enough talent and enough, if you have enough talent and play like a college team, a real team, I can make it dangerous. I love watching Utah.
College basketball is terrible, in my opinion.
I feel the same way. That's why I do the NBA stuff. But yeah.
Okay, so the Memphis game. Memphis is basically shut down anyone who's important, playing their young guys, however you would characterize it. But that was what they were doing 2 weeks ago, right? I just think that the difference is the only difference is that with Memphis now you have guys on rental contracts that are trying to really show the league that they deserve consideration for a spot somewhere in the league next year. So those guys are going to be playing hard, and that sometimes it creates a weird matchup when a team comes in really hungry, but they're hungry for something different, and it can be kind of hard to match that. So that's just a weird dynamic sometimes in a game like that. Thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts go back to the Memphis game that they lost 2 weeks ago, and Wayne Selden had 22 points in that game and kind of took over at the end of it. And Wayne Selden was out of the league a couple months ago. I do think he signed a rest of the season contract with the Grizzlies, but he's working to get noticed for next year. And Briante Weber, I know, was with Memphis for a while. It's kind of the same thing. It's kind of like individually motivated. It really reminds me of the good things of the G League. When you watch a good G League game, that you can see impressive play, but it's kind of more individualistic. But sometimes it works if they work hard enough. I really would think with Butler there to kind of stabilize things, I would be shocked if they lost that game. And I mean, it would be borderline Armageddon, I think, in Minnesota if somehow they lost again, because that would be 3 losses to Memphis this year. 3 losses. Memphis has 21 wins on the season. That'd be a mess.
Yes, as a Hawks fan, I'm tracking the exact number of wins the Grizzlies have. And then, so let's say that if the Timberwolves take care of business on Monday, and then if Denver loses to Portland, that would put Minnesota 1 game ahead of them heading into that game. Denver's 2 out of 3 against Minnesota, I think, which would, if Denver won, they'd be tied and split 2-2. And then they're in the same division. Yes.
The only way Denver can have the tiebreaker over the Wolves is if they beat Portland.
Okay.
So yeah, it could affect the Wolves in another team sort of way, but the Denver game is much more important for the Timberwolves if Denver beats Portland in advance of that. And I'm not ruling that out. Portland's lost 3 straight. They've kind of settled in, I feel, a little bit to the 3 seed.
And Lillard's, they're at a point where Lillard probably doesn't even be playing right now with the knee issues he's had off and on all season long.
It just kind of shows. I remember watching a few of the, and you guys did an episode on the Blazers right when they were in that hot streak, and that was right when they were playing the Wolves. I remember watching a few of those games in that time, and that Blazers team was clicking. And now it's pretty clear that, I don't know, the steam has kind of settled from that time. So and Denver's playing great right now. I wouldn't be surprised if Denver, it just feels like it's all shaping up for a Wolves Nuggets play-in game of sort.
So the playoffs start on the final day of the season, kind of.
Yeah, gosh. Hey, that would be, I don't even know what to think about it. I mean, this fan base has just been without playoff basketball for so long. So many people would just be so devastated. As much as I pointed out the extra draft pick thing, like nobody here in Minnesota gives two you-know-whats about that. Like it's been 13 years. They wanna get in, and even if it's just the 8th seed.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about a few items on the list.
Hey, this is Matt from the Super Hoopers. Scientists have rated us a top 3 NBA podcast. Number 1, of course, is Low Post. Number 2 is the podcast you're listening to right now. And we're number 3. We have great segments like Get At Me Dog, where we tweet at NBA players. Stefan A. Smith, where we talk to the analytics-minded brother of Stephen A. Smith. And Guerrilla Marketing, where we pay to advertise our podcast on rival podcasts like this one. So check us out, the Super Hoopers.
Were you even going to bother mentioning me in this promo?
Oh, that's my co-host, John. That's my co-host, John. Sitting right here. Your job is to run the dials, to make sure I sound good. So hopefully I sounded good.
Yeah. Dials ain't helping that voice.
All right, Super Hoopers, check us out.
Now that we're back, there's one game on Denver's season of recent. I don't know how closely you've been tracking them, that kind of unlocked all of these possibilities for Denver. Do you have any idea which Denver game I'm talking about?
Like play-wise, or the game that they won?
A game that they won that really they had no business winning.
Well, they were on a 3-game win streak before I'm only thinking of the third game before they played the Wolves. I'm thinking they beat the Bucks. Now what
that Bucks game. So the Bucks were up 3 with less than 3 seconds, and my God, yeah. I mean, it was a pick 6 on inbounds pass that went straight to Jamal Murray with Murray's full momentum going towards his basket, and then he gets fouled on a 3-point attempt and sends it into overtime. And I mean, the Bucks had like 3 or 4 chances just to secure the basketball to put that game away. When I saw them win that game, I was like, I see them on course now for. But that game, and it's funny because Greg and I were recording while that game was happening. Yeah, and we were talking about the Nuggets that had a lead for a while, and we're like, oh, the Nuggets are about to punt their season away, and then Milwaukee did what they did, and it's like Milwaukee. Oh,
no, it was just another one of the things. It's everything seems to be going against the Wolves' way. Last night, all those other teams they're competing with played the top 3 teams in the West. And they all won. They all beat the top teams in the West. That Milwaukee game, the losing to Memphis, it just, I don't know. It's one thing after another. It feels like with the Wolves, it's kind of breaking against them. I hope I'm not getting too negative, but it's been a long year of things like that. That Milwaukee game was, you're right. It does feel like it stabilized them. It seemed to give them some energy. I mean, Paul Millsap, I don't think he played great in that game, but he played great in the surrounding game. They clearly seem like a team with momentum right now. And you're right. If they take care of that game, I don't know if they have the same momentum when they played the Wolves or played any of these other games.
Yeah, and when you look at the challenges that Denver has on defense, you'd think that them missing Gary Harris would be a really big obstacle for them to overcome, because you're getting a whole lot of Jamal Murray and Will Barton, which is fine offensively, but a struggle to match up with a good backcourt defensively. And then the third guard, typically, I think right now is Devin Harris, is playing like he has defensive challenges. Gary Harris is so freaking good, and can lock down your best perimeter offensive player. And they just really, it's strange because I at times I'll watch Will Barton when he's engaged defensively, and I'll be like, impressed, and other times I'm like, what is he doing? So I don't know what the switch is that, it's usually off more often than it's on. But there have been times like where he's had to help close the game and the other team will go straight and attack him. And maybe in the last few minutes he kind of turns it on, when it's a close game, but maybe his attention span's harder to kind of manage across the whole game. Probably there's a lot of players that are like that.
Well, there's a lot of players like that on the Timberwolves. And that's what I was going to ask you is, so you got, of the really bad defenses in the NBA, the bottom 5 defenses in the NBA, there's 3 playoff teams in there in Minnesota, Cleveland, and Denver. And we'll leave Cleveland out of it for now. That's kind of a whole nother thing. Okay. What is the difference or why are the Nuggets bad compared to why the Wolves are bad? Is it are you seeing similar issues in schematically, or is it more of a switch that you talk about? Is it the same issues that are prevailing for both teams, or do you see different things with those two teams?
I see different things. I think it's so strange. Chris and I, when we did our crossover episodes, the subject of Mike Malone as a head coach comes up a lot. Yeah. And he's such a horrible fit for the roster he has. Because he's, I'm sorry if this is a repeat for people who listen to that, but I'll be quick. So his dad was a head coach for a long time. He's a legacy coach, just like Bickerstaff is. Silas's son is head assistant in Charlotte. Is going to get interviewed for openings this year as well, and that's a thing, But growing up around the game probably does give you. It's not like. There's not merit in that, it gives you exposure to and those sorts of things. So not criticizing any of those guys, but Mike Malone's dad coached in the league when coaches were like 99% focused on defense. And on offense, in that era, you're probably too young to have watched any of that live or tracked it live or what have you. You just let your 2 best players go to work. And they just didn't really give much instruction. You dump it into your best post player, or if the guy was a guard, you'd just get him a screen and let him get separation from his defender and let him go to work. And there wasn't really a whole lot of input apart from the innovators like Doug Moe and some of those guys. And Malone wants to coach a defensively oriented roster, which is the complete opposite of what he has. Although, like, Millsap's a wonderful defender. He's typically an all NBA level defender. But
Harris, who you just said.
Harris is a really good defender. But like Juancho Hernan-Gomez is a really good defender, but he's not playing. And I don't know if his season just never got back on track after he had mono and after he had an injury. But I look at that guy and think teams should be trying to snag him. He's super competitive, very versatile defender, and he has enough of an offensive game. But for example, they're playing Trey Lyles. Trey Lyles is very gifted on offense, but there's a reason why Utah was willing to move on from him and really never played him, is because he couldn't cut it on defense to the Jazz's expectations. And so much of this, if you map it back to what's really the binary factor here, is what does the organization expect of their players defensively? And as good as Trey Lyles is on offense, Utah basically said, you're never going to be good enough to satisfy what we expect from our players on defense. So you are out. I mean, you have no place here, and where the Nuggets will compromise on that end of the court. Right. And with Tibbs as the head coach of the Timberwolves, you think that there would be no compromise. And maybe that's part of why guys are playing 38 minutes game. And we were calling out the risk of a Butler injury all season long because of how short the rotations are and those sorts of things. But with the Timberwolves, it's more along the lines of, I think it's more of an issue of player development, because Wiggins will show flashes of a great defensive possession or a handful of like even consecutive really impressive defensive possessions. Then you'll see a whole game where it looks not invested on that end of the court. And then the same for Towns is that Towns his energy level and his effort always seems to be as high as you want it, but it's his decision making and in fighting he has bad instincts on defense. And I think the thing that he needs is to overcome but I think most players enter the league with bad instincts, so they'll overreact to a ball fake or they'll overreact to a dummy action. And, veteran NBA players use that against young guys all the time. But for me, when I look at Denver, it's a roster construction issue. Although I do think there are a few players available that they could play, but they would have to sacrifice on offense, and they win. The games they win by outscoring their opponent. Where with the Wolves, I think I see it more as a player development issue. Wiggins has not made progress as a defender. Towns has not made progress as a defender. Teague was brought in, and if they wanted to bring in the best defensive point guard that was available, no one's jumping straight to my head, but I mean, Rubio always had that reputation. But Teague certainly doesn't strike you as one of the best.
Well, George Hill would have been the comp from last offseason, would have been the one that was the.
And I did, and I heard through back channels that the Wolves were interested in him, but that
I can confirm what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah, that Hill was like, no, Tibbs is a sociopath and he will end my career. But to me, I think Nuggets, I see roster construction. Cavaliers, I see an old team that can't even put the effort forward on across the whole game. With the Wolves, it comes back to player development. So I think it's very different things. So your reaction to that?
Right. Well, I kind of had a feeling you might take that route because most people, I think they just look at it and you see a top six offense. Both have top six offenses. Both have top six defenses. I believe how it breaks down. And so you kind of just draw parallels. But what is interesting about both of those situations is that, like Mike Malone and Tom Thibodeau really cut their teeth in as defensive people. That is their calling card. And neither of them has been able to figure it out. And what is interesting is they've both, I think, have done it in the name of trying to outscore people. And I know maybe you didn't say that as much with the Wolves, but the reason I would suggest is if you look at, because that Thibodeau is also the president of basketball operations. Look at every move that he's made has been offense, not every move. The other free agents he signed have been offensively motivated. You mentioned Jeff Teague, Jamal Crawford, Derrick Rose, re-signed Shabazz Muhammad. I mean, those players are all clearly one-dimensional, they all, sans Boz, serve value on the offensive end of the floor. But so I guess I would push back a little bit and say I do think the main roster construction is there with the Wolves, but he hasn't done anything else to address roster construction. So I think it's a lack of player development in Minnesota and roster construction. I think it'll be addressed this offseason, or it should be. I don't know.
Yeah, but for me, as not following the Timberwolves every day, not being a vested fan, those sorts of things, it seems like Thibodeau showed up and on day one expected Towns and Wiggins to execute on defense day one, instead of saying, okay, at the quarter point in the season or the half point in the season, the first year under Tibbs, we're going to try to make progress and we're going to try to kind of have a goal or have an objective to kind of incrementally get them there. It was more like day one, nope, my expectations are resolute. They won't move. I expect it on day one. And I think one time when we recorded in the past, we talked about millennials and the types of persons that are coming to the league now, and then that style and whether that was a thing. Because I would have thought that, okay, Tibbs is coming in, very young team. You look back at that young players he had on the Bulls when he went there. Butler was a 4-year college player. Noah, I think, was a 3 or 4 year college player. But Towns, one and done. Wiggins, one and done. Completely different thing. And those Bulls players were much more developed before they even got to Chicago, where understandably, I think Towns and Wiggins arrived in Minnesota really with, being not very developed at all as teenagers.
A ton to learn and a lot of baggage, I think, from the way they'd grown up playing. With Andrew Wiggins, I actually saw Andrew Wiggins. Andrew Wiggins played my high school team when he was in high school, and he was a 8th or 9th grader on the team at the time, and it was just so clear that even then, as an 8th or 9th grader, it didn't matter fundamentally what he did because the athleticism was so there to just make up for it. And so whatever people point to the AAU upbringing, all this and that of not having learned. But at the end of the day, yes, it's to your point. They didn't have the college, playing in the college system. for many years. And so, yeah, Tibbs, I think, had unrealistic expectations of them being able to, if not defend immediately, pretty quickly. And I think he learned all of last season that they weren't picking it up. Karl Towns or Andrew Wiggins weren't. And that's why Jimmy Butler and Taj Gibson specifically were brought in so as to be mentor-mentees of Butler to Wiggins, Gibson to Towns. And Thibodeau wanted to take those two players who have been extensions of him. They were extensions of the coach when in Chicago, and they are again here in Minnesota. And he wants those guys to learn. He wants them to teach Towns and Wiggins to also be extensions of them. So I think it was, he was very resolute right away and realized it didn't work and thought he was gonna make it work, and he didn't. It's still kind of, it hasn't come to fruition. I do think both Towns and Wiggins have made some strides this year. They've improved, but if it was with like a strong player development program, I think it would have been much higher, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think Dane and I are laughing because I have the Hawks and Celtics on, and I joke with my fellow Hawks followers that they suck at tanking. Anyway, but yeah, I think it's more the progress they've made, in my experience, seems to be more a result of just reps. Just, repetitions and just learning by doing. But I also think that you have to give credit to Butler and Gibson for both being guys that lead by example. They play the right way. They're in the right spot. They communicate. They take smart risks. They don't, gamble in situations where you're going to give up an easy shot at the rim if you miss on that gamble, what have you. But I just, the young guys, you just don't see the trajectory at all in terms of, they don't look like guys that are in a player development program that are making taking steps and iterating towards being stronger defenders. They look like guys that, they'll have a nice game and then maybe they'll have a nice week and then they'll completely regress to where they were before, which is not indicative of, and I have to qualify that because I do have a firm belief that you have to be inconsistently good at something before you can become consistently good at it. Mm-hmm. But it's just off far too much for me to feel like the player development stuff is there.
Well, I think with the goal was that, Butler would take Wiggins under his wing and that Gibson would take Towns under his wing. And from my perspective, and this is, speculative, I'm there in the locker room sometimes and around the team sometimes. I'm not there, and knowing what all their off-court dealings is. What is very clear to me is that the person that Jimmy Butler has decided to put his arm around is Tyus Jones. Those guys are friends in a big brother, little brother type of way. The funny little anecdote is I was the Wolves were on the road and Tyus Jones's little brother was playing in the state tournament at Target Center where the Timberwolves play. And Jimmy Butler was home rehabbing. He wasn't, I think the Wolves were in Utah when the game was going, or no, Philadelphia. And so Butler's back home in Minneapolis and he comes to the game to watch Trey Jones, Tyus Jones's little brother, play. And he's FaceTiming Tyus from Philadelphia, showing him what's going on the floor. And so that's a friendship. They're clearly friends. And I think if Tibbs had his druthers, he would have said, why isn't this happening between Jimmy and Andrew? Why didn't they become tight? And I think that kind of goes back to our different personalities conversation we had, millennials and whatever. It's just Andrew and Jimmy, they're cool. They're clearly cool with each other, but they're not they don't necessarily mesh together like best friends in the way that one I always point to is Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan. They were just kind of put together somewhat randomly and they ended up becoming best friends. That didn't happen with Andrew Wiggins and Jimmy Butler. And in ways that's concerning. That might be the difference between the Raptors and the Wolves. Outside, there's a lot of the other factors, but that's important. I believe in that, in the value of bonds with each other and from the value of teaching. If the goal was for Jimmy Butler to teach Andrew Wiggins, I think we've seen a little bit of that, but it's been Butler kind of forcing it a little bit. I need to be that mentor. for Andrew, and it showed up a little bit. Andrew's improved a little bit on defense. I believe that, but it's not authentic in the way that it is with Jimmy and Tyus. And then interesting enough with Taj, who has been excellent this year and he's fantastic to talk to in the locker room. Like, I got a lot of respect for that guy. He doesn't really seem to have taken anyone in that way. Maybe that's just not his personality. He's just kind of do my job, do my role. I'm like lead by example. So in ways, I guess, if we're kind of speculating on what the Thibodeau mindset was here, is I don't think it all came together as he hoped. Though I don't know that that's exactly what the plan was, and I don't know if you had ever fully divulged that. But it's been a really interesting thing to track. I mean, it's fascinating, and the dynamics of locker rooms are just are interesting, and I think extremely important. It's those little differences that can be the difference between being a 48 win team and a 55 win team over time, you know? And it is just year one, but I don't know. As a coach, what is the value of player to player relationships, and how does that, is it more so or less so a thing, do you think, in the NBA?
I do think that the NBA is a little bit cliquish in terms of the guys that kind of really become buddies. So I have a generalization about Wiggins I want to check before I dive off and kind of answer your question. Is Wiggins, he comes across to me from a distance as being extremely shy. Is that the case, or is that just a misread from a distance?
Well, okay. I'd like to, before I covered the team, that's like, I was, doing it kind of on my own before it was actually my job. And that was Wiggins' rookie year. And I was just wildly frustrated with the inefficiency. I mean, he was shooting so many shots and it was so ineffective, inefficient. And I really built up a bias against, kind of him as a player. And, some of that is borne out. Like, he still kind of has some of that, but he is a very nice person and kind and shy, and he hears this stuff. He's never harsh about it at all. He's not a combative person in any way, which is different than, even Towns will be that way. Jimmy definitely is. A lot of the players in there, but yeah, he's shy. I think there's just a lot going on in his head, and there's so much going on in his head that he doesn't want to show, that he puts it out in very few words, which is, somebody could psychoanalyze that more so than I could. But I guess what I'm saying is I have tempered a lot of people on Twitter and Timberwolves land, I was like, Wiggins hate. Like, I've definitely tempered much of my Wiggins hate because he's a very affable person that is, I just don't think he's wired like I don't think he's wired like a star or the way we think of the traditional, players in that mold. So yes, I think he's shy.
Zero mama mentality.
Yeah.
Kobe, there's no Kobe in him at all. And it's funny because
except that his fadeaway jump shots.
It's true. Except shot selection. That's very much like it. Yeah. And it's funny because when Chris and I recorded last on an episode that should come out before the one that Dane and I recorded here, we were talking about which player was it? We were talking. I think I was talking about. We were actually talking about Jaylen Brown, and we were discussing the Celtics, and so Chris and I did a series of fixing the NBA teams, and then now we've moved on to Are We There Yet? And we did Are We There Yet with the Rockets, and then we did the Celtics, and I think we'll do the Sixers probably coming up here. Chris is avoiding the Raptors. I think because
I'll do that one with you.
yeah, okay. And that'll come up, and when we record with Greg here in a bit, talk about our playoff outlook. But one thing I told Chris was I might have what some people would call irrational bias towards Jaylen Brown because he's grew up in the Atlanta area. I have reached there, and I just happen to know he is a great kid, very thoughtful, very introspective. His worldview is something that I'm just amazed at his age that he's developed the worldview he has. And I don't know if you've had a chance to kind of hear anything about him. And so I told Chris, I said, I think the biggest risk if hypothetically some team to allow me to be a GM is I would just have a roster of all good guys. Yeah. And that would that be too soft? There'd be some risk in that when I know that I'm close enough to the sport and whatever levels that teams want guys to have a kind of a killer mindset. And at times that comes along with some, less than ideal behavior characteristics. The classic example in the last draft was Josh Jackson had issues that even were on the law enforcement radar at Kansas, but he was probably known as the one player in the draft that had the most killer mindset on the court. Like, I don't want to just beat you. I want to embarrass you. Mm-hmm. I want you to be ashamed of yourself after I beat you. And that's something I could never have been part of my personality playing. I mean, way back in the, I wanted to win, but sportsmanship was kind of a important thing to me. I thought, well, treat your opponent the way that you would want your opponent to treat you. Have some respect for them. But to be a champion, there are not that I would ever think that we should all get into group think and land on one right answer. And then sometimes when Chris and I do our own exercises, I tell him, I hate the exercise of good pile, bad pile. Everything goes on one or the other, because there's certainly a spectrum in between things. But there is a question, does the best player on a team have to have that killer mindset? It certainly you don't have to have that to win one, right? But to win, repetitive, to be at that level for a number of years, do you have to have, as problematic as Kobe's game was sometimes, that was there. Michael Jordan was, he had that killer instinct. There's no doubt about it. And then people have criticized LeBron for not being more like that. Yeah, LeBron's accomplished more than 2 or 3 players, in the league. And so I look at a guy like Wiggins and I think, I wouldn't criticize him for his personality. I wouldn't criticize him but it does.
That's who he is. That's what I'm saying. Is I guess I was so frustrated with him, and now getting to know him a little bit, I'm like, it's just who he is, and it
could hold him back from being able to be one of the, say, 2 best players on a championship contender. But my view having coached a lot of different types of kids and different types of teams at different levels is coaches should, I think the onus is on the coach to reach the player, wherever the player is, whatever personality the player has. And there are some situations where you just say in my corporate environment, there's sometimes I've had bosses like, this is not going to work. My work style and his or her, style of work it's just not a fit. And so it could be that Wiggins is one of those guys that needs to be in just the right environment, just the right situation for him to be able to make the most of himself. But there are real questions like, well, should you give that guy a max contract?
That's what I was going to say, is which is all okay. And I think I've also, tempered on Wiggins since I just came to kind of my own realization. And I was like, this guy's probably the 3rd or 4th best player on a championship team someday. That's just kind of who he's profiling as, or has, thus far. And which is fine. That's still, maybe that's not what you were hoping for with the number 1 overall pick, but you could probably work on that if it's developed in the right way and fit into the right mold through coaching, as you mentioned. But yeah, what becomes restrictive is his contract, and that you can't find 2 or 3 better players than him, given the money of what he's going to be making. Because I don't remember to what extent you and I have talked about this before, but Karl Towns is going to sign a 5-year contract for even more than what Andrew Wiggins is this summer. Jimmy has another year, and then he's up for a really big contract. And the Wolves are locked into this core, essentially, of Wiggins, Towns, Butler. And then once the guys like Gibson, their contracts expire, Crawford, the Wolves are going to be left picking at the scrap heap. Maybe mid-level exception. Maybe Justin Patton turns into something, maybe a couple draft picks. But it's kind of the notion of that this is the way Andrew Wiggins is. And I personally don't have a belief that he's going to become a real killer. I question if it's ever going to be enough, if this is the core.
Yeah, but I also happen to think that Wiggins is tradable, even on that contract. And because it only takes one team and it only takes one organization, and there are so many organizations that are hungry for elite athleticism, elite talent, and Wiggins certainly has all of that. And it wouldn't take much at all for organization to talk themselves into, hey, we can do more with him than they did with him. And so that might be the end game with Wiggins for the roster, is that he ends up bringing back someone who is a better fit, has the mindset that fits kind of the team mindset, those sorts of things. But to go back to Taj for a second, the way I've used Taj, and this is from a distance as well, is I think he, first of all, most of his leadership belief is that you lead by example, and he plays hard all the time. He's looking to do constructive things on both ends of the court all the time. He's as selfless as any player in the league. And then I look at, for example, in Boston, probably the most valuable aspect of them having brought in Al Horford was the positive impact he's having on all those young players that are there. Habits, the kind of teammate you are, the way you put your team ahead of yourself, the way that you pay attention to the fundamentals at the atomic level all the time. And I think that's benefiting them. But I think he looks at, for the roster turnover from last season to this season was they brought back 3 players. And his performance, his approach to the game has not changed at all. He's like, this is what I do. This is what I'm about. This is what I'm going to continue doing, continue being about. And so, but I look at Butler's leadership style and it's pretty different. And that probably has something to do with his personality, where he needs a certain comfort level to really open up and really invest in someone else. And where Taj has a completely different style, which is more of like, I'm here. If you guys want to come pick my brain, I'm available to everybody, that.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
I think that's accurate. And given what Towns and Wiggins' styles are, I think to some extent they don't necessarily think they need it. They know they need to improve, but they don't see as much of the value in it. I think with kind of both of them, it needs to be kind of like hammered home a little bit. Like, you're great. I mean, objectively, they're all great at playing basketball. I mean, Towns and Wiggins are,
and they've been hearing that since they were 12,
which is huge. And I think particularly with Towns, he just doesn't believe that he's actually a below average defensive center.
Yeah. And if you look at Butler's path, how could he connect with a number 1 overall draft pick? He wasn't even widely recruited as a high school player. Well, he was he wasn't an obvious NBA player at the college level. He was taken 30th, and that was even viewed as, okay, it's the 30th pick in the first round, and this is a stretch, even at the time he was drafted. And so I would ask a guy who took that path to the league, does he have any grasp of what it's like to have taken the path to the league that Wiggins and Towns has taken? I mean, how could he understand that? Because he had none of that in his journey to where he is.
Well, and if you want to even go before the draft, Jimmy to this day talks about, once per interview, talks about growing up super poor and from being from Tomball, Texas, and having whatever the opposite of a silver spoon feeding him was. And, my experience in life is that people who have those type of harsher upbringings, poor upbringings, can resent people with a silver spoon. And I'm not saying he doesn't seem to resent Andrew Wiggins in any sort of way, or Karl Anthony Towns. There's no resentment, but I do think it's harder for them to mesh, because
I think the word they might use is they have more respect for people who took the same path they did.
True. And Andrew Wiggins didn't. I mean, his dad was in the NBA. His mom was an Olympic sprinter. I mean, I'm speculating on what the finances of that upbringing was. And from what I understand of Karl Towns, is he had a very traditional, maybe be more described as middle class upbringing, but his parents and his family has been like a huge part of his life. He was raised in a very stable Christian home. Yeah. So in ways, it's confounding to who Jimmy was, and then just personality types too. Some of that explains some of the struggle in getting to really sync up.
Yeah, totally. And then I think Tibbs being of the era adds another kind of level of complexity, in that this group just may not be able to kind of have too many obstacles to kind of getting all on the same page and really kind of buying into one another. And I have some notes from when we recorded with Greg, your player preview, on some teams that do they have confidence in one another. And I think that's the biggest issue with this Minnesota team is, Do they have confidence? And you can try to pretend for a while, but if it's not real, it's eventually going to be revealed that, we're a group of people who don't have confidence in one another. And that's a major issue to becoming the best version of the team that you can become, is really believing in the group, and that seems to be the thing that's most lacking, and for all these reasons we've talked about. But to try to kind of summarize it, is I just view them as a group of people that they don't really believe in the group that they have.
Ever since listening to that most recent Kevin Durant and Bill Simmons podcast, which I found great and to be frustrating, but whatever, just to kind of focus on one thing from that, is Kevin Durant said what he kind of struggled with most about the media was when people try and speculate on what's going on in their heads, and what's kind of the mental aspect of who they are as people and the relationships and stuff like that. And obviously with Durant, there's the whole Westbrook and he really found frustration in people speculating on what the inner dynamics of that were. And I get that. And I'm sure that was really misrepresented a lot of the time for him. But I think about it for me as my job to look into these things and write and report and do podcasts like this about it. And to some degree, I mean, I need to speculate and think about these mental makeup issues or lack thereof of issues. And I don't want to put it in the one pile or the other pile, but I think it's okay for us to talk about it, because history has shown us that years later, when people write their books or when people are no longer affiliated with the team or whatever, they air it out. And I think I would be surprised if years down the road, Jamal Crawford, once he's retired and in the front office, he talks about a locker room in Minnesota at the end of his career that just couldn't quite sync up, kind of in the ways that he's talked about that in LA with the Clippers, when he was there. I guess I feel okay about our speculation because it could be happening. And if we have these little bits that suggest it, then there's probably some issues. There probably are some issues with the way that the players on the Minnesota Timberwolves interact with each other. Yeah,
it's a real thing. And people who listen to me religiously, whatever number of people that is, my educational background's in psychology, so I do gravitate towards these types of this type of analysis, and I think it's a real factor in terms of what a team's trajectory.
But the majority of what you do, and why I think it's okay for you to talk about it, is the majority. From listening to your podcast and conversations I've had with you, is you do take the game in X's and O's and extrapolate much of your opinion off of that, gather numbers that back up or make you
go back and look again. Yeah.
Look again.
Yeah.
And then this is another factor, and it's much more ambiguous, but it
is. And so where I'll try to do, or my intent, at least kind of reflecting against KD's comments to Bill Simmons, is I don't think you'll ever hear me criticize a person for being who they are, but it's a factor in terms of what can you expect from that person, or what type of environment will that person thrive in, or what type of coach can help that person unlock more of their game. And so I don't think I ever bring judgmentalism to it at all, but I think it's a real part of trying to build a championship team is that the human factor is real. And you see some teams like already in Philadelphia. I still remember everyone laughing at the 41 game over under before the season, but one of the things that has allowed them to push towards the 50-win mark is you watch them play and they really believe in one another. They really believe in one another. And from afar, it's like, well, how much credit does Brett Brown get for that? I mean, him getting some of those players through those years, there's only a few that made it all the way through, but this first year, how much belief they have in each other is incredible. And you don't see any of the infighting, or it's my credit versus your credit, or it's my team versus, you don't see, there's none of that. Where with the Timberwolves, you see many moments, many times where it's like, it just doesn't look right. It doesn't look like these guys believe in each other. And I honestly think that I don't know how that gets fixed. I don't know if that means you trade Wiggins and bring in someone who's, and it's funny because in the league, buddies tend to gravitate towards each other and want to play together, even though the banana boat team has not ever happened. Right. But I mean, contracts become the obstacle to there because I saw something on Twitter. I think Chris posted something on Twitter about who's going to be the best player on the Mavericks next year, and it was 4 guys who aren't on the Mavericks, and one of them was Marcus Smart, and I don't know who the person was, but it said Marcus Smart's not going to play for the Mavericks. He wants to play on a winner. And I wanted to reply like, all players at the end of their rookie scale chase the biggest contract they can get wherever it is, as they should. As they should. Yeah. And so Marcus Smart is going to play for the team that will pay him the most. So that tends to trump even like relationships, even with like best friends and those sorts of things. But I don't know if Tibbs will ever be the right coach for this group of guys. I don't know if Wiggins will ever be the right guy to play next to Towns. I don't know if Butler is going to ever kind of really feel the way about Towns that he does about the backup point guard. But there seems to be a long way to go. But I'm not going to sit here and say it can't happen either, because if guys are really at the end of the season, you look back and if they can, do a retrospective and say, okay, the thing that really held us back this year is that we didn't have confidence in each other. So what do we need to do to build confidence in one another? And not that you have the conversation in front of the team, but when the front office and coaching staff are doing evaluations, like, well, we got to get this guy out and bring in some other type of person, those discussions happen, and it's going to be really interesting to see what this team looks like next year. So, last question here. So let's assume they make the playoffs. Everybody who is a fan of or has any type of investment in these Western Conference teams wants to avoid the 7 and 8 seed. There might be some teams that feel like if they'd rather catch the Warriors in the first round than the other round, because Steph is, I think, already been ruled out of that round. Kevin Durant's still on that team. Andre Iguodala is still on that team. Draymond Green.
Andre Iguodala is the second one you bring up.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But Draymond Green is still on
the Wolves have no shot. I know where you're going with this. You're saying, who do I want the Wolves to play?
Yes.
I mean, Rockets, I would bet most likely outcome is a sweep. I think they could steal one from a Warriors team a game. So you get to 5. So I don't know. Neither of those, obviously, put those way out of the way. And where I've been at for a long time, and I hope this isn't me being stubborn, but it was a strong opinion I had prior to the Blazers really going on their run. I really think the Wolves match up well with Portland. The issues I see with the Timberwolves, well, defensively, I think they struggle against a very strong offensive rebounding, kind of like a rim running center. Steven Adams has given them tons of problems this season. DeAndre Jordan, that type of center, that doesn't really exist in Portland, or less so than the other possible teams. So I like how that's not there.
Yeah, Ed Davis does that in bits.
But not like Steven Adams.
Not nearly on the scale of those other guys.
Exactly. I like that that's not there. They don't really have a stretch 4 that can punish the Wolves. And I think particularly in a playoff series, a Carmelo Anthony type of playmaking for KD, Draymond, that type of player really punishes the Wolves. Al-Farouq Amino has been great for them, but he's essentially, I mean, he's a good player. He'll hit some.
He's really good.
But he's not what I'm describing, right?
Yeah, he's a stretch 4 in that he can catch and shoot.
Yes.
He's not going to do anything with the dribble.
And I think that is a real area that pokes at the holes of the Wolves. Nemanja Bjelica has very, very slow feet. And I mean, we did see when they played the Thunder, and it was just belly guarding Carmelo. They literally just said, okay, go to work, Melo. And as for Melo's flaws,
if he has a slow-footed, unathletic power forward on him, he's going to take advantage of that. Taj Gibson is very good at defending that, but he is also such a free safety, such a help option for that. He also often guards the strongest center. I think that you're really looking. I really do think a playmaking four can punish the Wolves. I feel good about the Blazers not having that. And with Dame and CJ, that's obviously their biggest assets. Is you have Jimmy Butler and Andrew Wiggins, who are much bigger and have the physical tools to athletically stay with those two players.
Yeah, they can stay in front of those guys.
And I think that's big. And obviously, I'm accentuating all the positives right here. But pro and cons list, if you and I went through the teams, I really think that. Well, for me, I'll let you go, but there's really it tilts towards Portland, and I know they're the 3 seed. I guess I'm kind of ruling out like New Orleans, but of the Utah, of the Oklahoma City, and obviously of the top 2 teams, I would say I think they have a shot against Portland.
So in your mind, they could at least be considered maybe not a favorite, but on like 50-50 outcome for the series.
Maybe like 40%.
Okay.
But because they would be on the road.
But the Pelicans, Spurs, Utah, no one wants to play Utah. Oklahoma City, any of those stand out from the group as someone that you'd have to be a little bit more?
Pelicans.
Okay.
I think definitely the Pelicans. I guess the reason I kind of leave them off is, at this point of the season, when I said 80 games in, I don't really understand how a Pelicans-Wolves matchup happens in the games. I need to run that out. Yep. But that's, they beat the Pelicans all 4 times. I think 2 of which they had Boogie. The Wolves do match up very well there. Anthony Davis would probably get 40 a game, but they're just inherently more limited. And I think they're limited defensively in being able to, for all the Wolves' faults, and we haven't even really talked about this much, they have a great offense. A great offense. And when Butler's back, elite level offense. I do not think the Pelicans, even with Anthony Davis, could go blow for blow with the Wolves' offense. And then San Antonio scares me because of Pop.
Right.
And LaMarcus, people are like, I literally just recorded with my buddy Tim Fakeless, who I work with, and we have our own podcast. And he was like, yeah, well, it's the Spurs. Like, they got Aldridge, and then that's it. The Aldridge is something, man. Like, Aldridge is working his way into like not the MVP conversation, but getting like votes for, that's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, and we'll talk about this, but I was for the other episode when I was putting together a list of like top 10 type of guys, I was like, I'm putting LaMarcus Aldridge in the top 10 MVP candidates in the league. So it's not like they have nothing there. I'm even assuming no Kawhi at this point. I wouldn't want to play that team in the playoffs. And then I really think the Thunder, they're going to be a different team in the playoffs, or a more engaged team in the playoffs. And the engaged Thunder really scare the crap out of me if I'm the Wolves, because they have every one of those things that can punish the Wolves and a pick and roll point guard. The Wolves have no freaking idea how to like read a point guard if they're going to pull up on a screen roll, go all the way to the bucket. Steven Adams, Russell Westbrook, I don't even want to like imagine what the points per possession of high screen and roll with those two would be in the playoff series, because they would run it to death. That I've been saying that, so maybe this is me holding on to this narrative. I've been saying this for like 50 games. Like, I don't want the Wolves to play the Thunder, but I'm concerned about the Wolves if they match up with the Thunder.
Yeah, I think the only pushback out there is that the Thunder can at times just beat themselves.
Yep, sure.
So that's not making you feel better about your team. That's you hoping that their flaws kind of come to take them down.
Right. My counter would be, I think the Wolves can just beat themselves as much as the Thunder can beat themselves. So that it's
okay.
Yeah.
Last question.
What about you? I want to know I know we got to wrap this up, but you don't even need to elaborate. You don't have to say Portland, because I did.
No. I do think because Portland generates a ton of their offense from the backcourt, from the perimeter, that the Wolves' defensive issues will not be exploited as much. And so in that way, I can see that matchup. I think one of the issues with playing the Pelicans, and I brought this up before, I don't ever hear anyone talking about it, but one of the risks of building an offense around a center is that in certain matchups, there's the risk of foul trouble, and then your primary offensive player goes to the bench, that sort of thing. And so that's an issue with the Pelicans. Also, just keeping Steven Adams off the offensive glass could create fouls, right? So I think you're right to call that out. But I think Timberwolves fans should hope for a matchup that'll get them to like at least 6 games, because I talk a lot about the fact that a team is not going to have success in the postseason until they go through the postseason and experience the postseason, because the way you plan for the postseason, the way you scheme for, the way you prep for, the way, it's all like a different game. Playoff basketball is really different from regular season basketball. It'll be interesting to see where you and Greg and I land when we talk about the Sixers, because I've already seen people projecting them into the finals, and I view them as a team that has not even played a single playoff game yet. And that to me is a thing. It helps when you have guys like JJ Redick around who have a lot of experience, but that's not something that gets transmitted via osmosis. You have to go through it. And so, for example, I think this Utah team this year, even though the roster is different, they lost Gordon Hayward, I think they were stronger this year, or were able to deal with adversity better because they won that series against the Clippers. It just, that feedback loop of confidence, and then saying, hey, in that series, we had to go into LA and win game 6, or we were dead, and we found a way to do it. And so even though the roster turnover was quite a lot, the DNA of the team is changed once you push through. Even if you lose, if you were competitive, you can go back and look at lessons learned. And then the next step is the first time you win, and you realize, because the first time you win a series is almost never going to be like, oh, we're hands down the favorite. You're going to have to fight through adversity to get there. And then that's the stuff that starts creating a team that can really, you have to win 4 7-game series to win the playoffs. And that's what makes the NBA so unique to me, is that's not the case in football, obviously. It's not the case in Major League Baseball. But you have to go head to head against other good teams and win 4 series in a row. And so that's something you have to build up over a few seasons, and so the Timberwolves have 0 experience, like in that the Sixers do. But I understand. I would, if someone asked me if it were this were your team, would you be preferring the draft pick over the 7 or 8 seed? I would tell you, man, that's a hard call, because if they can even get 3 competitive games out of 5 against a Houston or a Golden State team, that feedback loop of how you dealt with what you dealt with is so valuable to future playoff scenarios. But just having the other team just mop the floor with you does.
And that's only 200 minutes is what I'm saying, is if they get swept. Right. It's literally, what is that, 190
I think a sweep has very little feedback value in a feedback loop. I think.
Okay. So then what about a 6 or 7 game loss in one round?
A ton of value.
A ton more. Okay.
Yep.
Right.
Because that means you got a couple wins. And that means that you, like, for example, last year, if you reflect back on the Rockets and Spurs, I think if they had any questions about the fact that they needed to manage Harden's energy and fatigue issue, it was right there. And this year, I'm like, okay, since January 15th, they played the 7th slowest pace. They're still have the same goal on offense, and then they want the other team's defense to have to make really hard choices in middle of play. But I have said before the first half of the season, like, this is crazy. This is not going to work. James Harden and Chris Paul are not the guys asked to play at a top 5 pace in the league. Their bodies will not handle it. And I'm going to assume D'Antoni listened to my podcast, has got the idea from me that they needed to slow it down. But now that they're slowing it down, I think it's much, much more realistic to think that Harden and Paul are going to be able to make it through. But even still, when Chris and I did the Are We There Yet on the Rockets, I had said Rockets need to get out of the first and second round, but like having played no more than 9 games, 10 at the most. Because if they want Harden and Paul to have the ability to go 7 games in a conference finals and 7 games in a NBA finals, that if they have played 12, 13 games in the first 2 rounds, I think they're going to just have too much wrist around the gas. But I do think that the Timberwolves and people who are investing in Timberwolves should hope that they get into a matchup that gives them at least a 6-game experience and kind of get that feedback loop. Because even like if you look back to the Celtics, one of the reasons that Danny Ainge totally turned his roster over is he saw what that group of guys could. He saw the apex of that group on the court, and Cleveland just crushed them. They had nothing for Cleveland, and I think that was a huge part of Danny Ainge going. And this is the thing where you look at the fan base. And they were all in on Isaiah. And they loved Avery Bradley and Jay Crowder. Yeah. And then Ainge was like, yeah, this team's not going anywhere. And I've been on record for 2 years saying the starting backcourt of Isaiah Thomas and Avery Bradley ain't winning you anything. And that they're going nowhere as long as that's their starting backcourt. And sure enough, Ainge was like, and I give credit to Ainge. And I'm like, he did what the Hawks wouldn't do. Mm-hmm. I mean, Ainge was like, okay, we got to a conference finals. We were a 1 seed, but this team achieved the most they will ever achieve this season, and then we didn't get to the finals. Hawks had the 60-win season, and they were super injured by the time they got to the Cleveland matchup, but I don't Hawks fans who think that series would have gone differently after the 60-win season if Thabo Sefolosha were available, as much as I love Thabo. No, it would not have gone differently at all. But so they lost Horford in free agency, then they lost Millsap in free agency, where Ainge was like, no, I'm going to take these players and turn them into younger, into assets, younger players, prospects that have real upside. And so credit to him for doing that.
Yeah, it's very rarely maybe being a player improved him there, but Danny Ainge specifically has had that playoff experience and kind of knows, he knows about that. Like it's nut cup check, like time and maybe was more apt to be able to recognize that than, I guess was Budenholzer was he the president at the time, president of basketball operations?
No, I don't
think
so Ferry was technically that season. Ferry was on, he's suspended or whatever the status was. But at the end of the season, they made him the president of basketball operations. Mm-hmm. Now, was that the plan all along? They just waited to announce it, probably. But this mouse back again. You look at what's going on in Detroit and here, and is like, can that be successful at all?
Well, that's what. So, spinning back to the Timberwolves specifically in the fan base is there's a bunch of loud fire Tibbs stuff, but it's from people who haven't necessarily maybe thought it through to the full degree. I mean, Tibbs still has 3 more years and $24 million left on his contract. That makes him a crazy, high expensive, highly paid coach. And so I think the conversations I have a little bit more respect for when the people have kind of brought it up is, what if we take away the president of basketball operations from Tibbs? We look at what happened with Doc in LA. That pretty clearly has helped the Clippers, this season. And you look at what Stan Van Gundy to the Pistons is, a lot of people like to say he was trying to save his job by making this Blake trade and making the playoffs. He might lose his job. And in the shrapnel around that is this Blake Griffin trade that they made. They were the one team who traded for Andrew Wiggins that we were talking about before. Like they were the one team that would trade for Blake Griffin. And so I think the proper calls of frustration with Tibbs or an action plan is not to say fire him, is to say, can we convince him to just be the coach? Yeah.
And we don't need to. We'll wrap up here in the next 30 seconds or so, and then we'll switch over and record with Greg. But I just think coaches have very, very short-term focus, and a front office needs to be thinking about that 3 to 5 year window, whether you're building up towards something or whether you're trying to sustain something. Like the Timberwolves should be trying to build up to something. The Warriors are trying to sustain something. A team that I root for, the Hawks, are trying to find foundational players that will be real core pieces of a potentially good team 3 to 5 years from now. They're not trying to win the championship next season, But I'm great as a fan of the Hawks, and I'm way more analytical as a fan than I'm like emotionally invested. But I'm grateful that Bud is just the coach now, and I know there's some risk that he's not going to stick around through a 2 to 3 year rebuild, but that's okay. I want him to I want him to be the coach 10 years from now. But if he's not up for that, then You know, I believe in self-determination. That's why I never criticize KD for going to the Warriors, you know, what have you. But I do think that the league has largely evolved to, it's a terrible idea to combine those roles. So.
Yeah. Well, and it just separating the two, you know, seems to make sense, because again, I just think about it with the Timberwolves is there's been a few moves that have been made that clearly have Thibodeau's prints all over them, trading for Butler, and they were kind of immediate moves to the Jeff Teague and the Taj Gibson, like, okay, this window right now. But what's concerning is the 3 to 5 years down the road moves that he's made are signing Gorgie Jang to a rookie contract extension that is in year one right now, 4 years and $64 million. And then Andrew Wiggins is the other one that isn't next year, is year one of 5 years, $147 million.
And Towns will agree to an extension in September, October, right?
For the Marcus Smart reasons that we were talking about. I mean, it's not.
So they're going to have to become a team that will attract really good supporting players that will play for the mid-level exception or will play for the veteran minimum. That's the only path.
But the thing is, and that's what everyone said, and there's like a strong point to that. It's like, wow, look at what the Rockets did with PJ Tucker this year. They got him for the full mid-level exception. Look at what the Rockets did with Luke Bahamute. I feel like people always point to like Mike Miller back on the Miami Heat days. The difference is that the Wolves might be in the luxury tax next year.
Right.
And if they haven't shown a playoff pedigree, that's concerning, because that mid-level exception contract, if they are a tax team or a repeater tax team, is not a mid-level exception anymore. Yeah, it's a max contract.
I think people forget the repeater penalties are pretty harsh.
And that is like
the Wizards next year. Like they're in the tax this year.
Yes.
They're a 7-8 seed. Looks like they have really they're not a threat in the Eastern Conference. We'll get into that with Greg. But they're going to have to trade Otto Porter if they're going to want to kind of find some flexibility to adjust the roster. They have to trade him, and he's tradable. But
it's the biggest. That's the biggest big picture narrative that I can put out that I feel that people do not know with the Minnesota Timberwolves is that
tax repeater status is hard to deal with.
That is extremely hard to deal with, and the Wizards are a perfect example of that. And while it seems like the Wolves have this bright future with Towns being 22, Wiggins 23, Tyus Jones is still 21. He's a good player. Jimmy Butler, if he's healthy, he's still 29. I mean, it looks like there's this long, optimistic future out there, and it could happen. But they're going to need to nail every move going forward on the margins, because the money, they cannot afford to miss on anyone else.
Yeah, and I know it's not very well known, but like Miami last season at the trade deadline made moves simply to get under the tax, so to not have the repeater issue. And Portland this season made moves near the deadline to get under the tax, so just not deal with repeater.
Los Angeles, the Clippers this year
did
a million different moves where they only brought in G League players so that they were literally like $300,000 under it. They had like that type of budget to work with for the whole year.
Okay. We'll wrap up here. Check out Dane Moore's work at Zone Coverage. Wolves Wired
Wolves Wired is the podcast I do. If you're looking for a Timberwolves related podcast, I write at zonecoverage.com and
at Daynor NBA.
Daynor NBA on Twitter. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks guys for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully there'll be one more to do, meaning that the Timberwolves,
another check-in.
Yeah, we'll see if they get in and see what they do. So thanks as always for listening. And check the feed shortly for an episode where Dane will join Greg and I to do a playoff preview and awards. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Full Court Press Podcast. Subscribe free on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Play Store. Follow the Full Court Press NBA Podcast on Twitter at Press Podcast.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah, hang on a sec.
You've been riding this thing all day, and my son would like a turn.
He seems a bit young for this twin-cylinder hog, doesn't he?
It's a coin-operated kiddie bike.
No, ma'am. It's a coin-operated freedom machine.
No, it's a kiddie bike.
It's hard to be without your bike, so do something easy and protect it with Progressive Motorcycle Insurance. With basic policies as low as $75 a year, you'll be back on the road in no time. Visit Progressive.com to quote today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Annual premium for basic liability policy not available in all states.